You're listening to Science and Saucery, a show dedicated to adding life to your years. And now your hosts, registered dietitian Juliana Hever and scientist Ray Cronice.
Welcome.
Hello.
I love our intro song.
Love this song.
It's really a lot of fun.
We were able to hear it live the other night.
We were.
And it was so great. Like, I can't decide if I like it better recorded or live because it's such a great song and the words are so beautiful. Yeah,
Dave is such a talented musician. I've known him since he was 15 and I was maybe a year or two older. We were in high school together. He was actually another high school in Huntsville, and he went on to be in the classic rock band Brother Kane, which was popular in the late 90s and toured with all kinds of people. He's now in Atlanta Rhythm Section, so he still tours with them, but we get to hear him live, local. He plays here, and he's really a lot of fun.
Yeah, highly recommend you check him out.
And we'll put a link on our show notes this time for his iTunes version of Welcome.
Yes.
You really need to hear the lyrics and hear them and listen to the lyrics carefully. So download the song, support him, and it's now our theme song.
Yeah, and it always makes us all bob our head when it starts going when we're listening. You can't not get into that song.
It's become us now.
Yes.
So today.
Raymond, it is cold outside.
Gloves before sweater makes you look better. It's finally winter. I know I'm saying always winter never comes, but finally it's here.
Yeah, all right. So here's your thing. You always love to say, all balls are floating today. Pray tell, what the heck does that mean?
I have one of those Galileo thermometers that my kids got me for Christmas one year. And I think the bottom temperature is like 64, 62 degrees or something like that. And I love when the temperature drops down at night and gets below that number so that final ball floats. And so my kids would always joke. They'd be in Dad's cold house and we'd all be saying all balls are floating, look over there. And you'd see that all of them are there. But it really turns out that if you allow yourself to slowly adapt to the cool temperatures in the fall, it turns out they're not that cold. You're not always freezing. And so one of the things that everyone can do as part of fall, and this is part of, that bigger strategy of metabolic winter, which is cool, dark, still, and scarce, is that idea of letting a little bit of the chill in.
Because we all go throughout our lives on one temperature, right? We go, like today, I'm going to go to the airport and it'll be cold, the same temperature, and I'll go to the airplane and then I'll get in the car and then I'll go back to my apartment and it'll be the same temperature. And like you live your life.
Except for your clothes change in the winter and the summer, even though the temperature is the same year round in all those places you just went. I mean, if you think about it, other than the short period of time you spend going from the front door to the car and the car to into the airport, every other temperature is the same. And yet we dress different in the summer and winter. And so when you think about that over-bundling, over-layering is just one of those things that have changed in the last century. We don't experience that temperature anymore.
Okay, so back up. So you wrote an extraordinarily disruptive and amazing paper called The Metabolic Winter Hypothesis with both David Sinclair from Harvard and Andrew Bremmer from NIH. And Tell us, what does this mean? What does it matter? What is the metabolic winter hypothesis, Raymond?
Yeah, so one of the things we all ask was, and it started with a conversation really that David and I had, which was I was doing the mild cold stress and used it to burn calories and lose weight. And even though it's hard to imagine, 10 years ago, everybody sort of thought you burn way more calories when you're hot than cold. In fact, if you go back to the old articles that came out around 2009 when I did my TED Med talk, you'll see that there's so many people that get it wrong. But today, with Wim Hof and most of the other stuff that's out there on cold, including what we've done with our paper and getting the information out there, people understand what they should have understood 10 years ago, which everyone understood 100 years ago, no problem, which is your body expends a lot of energy to stay warm. I mean, think about it. If you're 98.6, if you had a 170-pound metal object sitting outside and you wanted to keep it 98.6 degrees, at any temperature, what would you have to put in terms of electricity or power into it to keep it that temperature? And your body, even though you might feel cold, if we measure your internal temperature, you could stand out in a pretty cold day and you would still stay in essentially 98.6. So that energy is expended. And so we took it beyond the weight loss. And what David had explained is that at the cellular level, that there are some changes that happen at the mitochondrial level that overlap with dietary restriction without malnutrition. And that's what kind of started off the idea of writing the paper.
How do they overlap?
Well, it turns out that paradoxically, that our body producing, like for example, irisin, which is a hormone that actually causes white adipose tissue to brown, meaning it actually gets more mitochondria. Brown adipose tissue is kind of like think of it as like a heat organ. It's a very loose way to think of it, but essentially all it is white adipose tissue that has a ton of mitochondria, and the little mitochondria are brown and cause it to look brown. And the mitochondria is the power plant. It's the part that sort of creates all the energy. It ends up in the muscle or in any other tissue creating ATP, and that ATP is what fuels motion. And in this case, what ends up happening is that brown adipose tissue at a certain point ends up sort of short-circuiting the ATP process, and it just produces waste heat. And so one of the paradoxical things that we've talked about is why something, for example, shivering, which is a lot like exercise, and you're moving and your tissues are moving, why that action of wasting energy in a time when food is scarce, why would you create a tissue that's sole purpose is to waste energy to make you warm? And our hypothesis was that those were tied together, that this upregulation, and we go into the details of the mechanism that happens at the mitochondrial level, we can see that there's an overlap. In other words, there's an overlap of dietary restriction, how the mitochondria responds, and we explain more of that in the paper. It's probably too much detail to go in for this short of a place, but that overlap between how the mitochondria responds to times of low food or low energy intake and times of cold stress, that they paradoxically overlap. And so it makes one wonder, was shivering the original exercise? How much of the health benefits of the stress of exercise beyond the muscle growth side, but how much of that is actually related to the kinds of stress we would see and the hormesis that we would see, the hormetic response that we would see from being cold. And so we put together several of these concepts because we wanted to continue looking at this broader application. And we also introduced the food triangle in that paper as well. So does that cover enough of it, you think?
Well, no, I mean, I think, we'll have the paper linked here. I think everyone should check it out. I love the bit.ly too. It's winter never comes.
Yes.
And I mean, that's the takeaway, right? Part of it is we're living in this one state right now in modern times. We are neglecting what our bodies are used to or what we've evolved to. And we have this kind of fake world that we live in this mono temperature that's not, what we're used to, having seasons and all that. So I think that, everyone should read this paper because it's really interesting and provocative, and it makes you kind of think outside of what you're normally used to. Like, this is just normal for us to go around, in the same temperature all day long.
Yeah, it's our normal. Maybe it's not everybody's normal. But the thing that we can really go to with this is, when you think about the seasons and you think about the idea that every biological organism in your backyard or the park, if you're in a city, every organism responds to the seasons. The trees, the grass, the insects, the animals. Are we really that naive to think that in 100 years, since we've had basically ubiquitous food and temperature control, HVAC, so transportation and refrigeration have sort of changed our environment, that we have no genes, no adaptive genes, nothing that responds to the seasons? Yeah, we have a circadian clock that runs 24 hours a day, but we don't have anything that responds to the season. And I think that's kind of a big leap. And to me, the idea of metabolic seasons, meaning metabolic winter, cool, dark, still, and scarce, versus metabolic summer, which would be warm, bright, active, and abundant. And think about it. Warm, bright, active, and abundant. This is what we sell. Lots of food, lots of gym memberships, lots of activity, lots of warmth. We love those things. But the point here is that idea, getting back to what you just said about winter never comes, we don't have that seasonal cold stress. And what if that seasonal cold stress has some bearing, just like we know that dietary restriction does? I mean, it's just unquestionable that dietary restriction does. So what if these other elements matter just as much? That we need some times of longer sleep, that we need some times of mild cold stress, that we need some times of dietary restriction.
It explains a lot of things that we've seen kind of evolve in the last, decades of, the SAD, seasonal affective disorder, people having, we have alarm clocks to wake up. We have the same schedule all year pretty much. We adjust everything according to our modern world. And honestly, I'm from Los Angeles. I've grown up in the city my whole life. I never saw what I see here, where every morning when we're having tea and I see squirrels hopping, but then at this time of the year, you've got the cicadas and everything really changes with the seasons. We don't have quite pretty much at all any seasons in Los Angeles. So it's really interesting to kind of learn and be, I'm in a real modern society, like a real, like away from nature, which I don't love, but it's very interesting for me to kind of spend more time now where there are seasons. And it does change the way you feel. It changes your mood. It changes, everything changes. And if you allow some of that and you kind of make room in your schedule and you make room in, your food choices, all of that really kind of helps. And I think it's really a healthy new perspective, or just a new way to look at your day-to-day life that you may not have thought about prior to this.
And you mentioned cicadas. They're gone now, is what you were saying, and they were very, very loud several months ago. It's really funny when Stephen Leckhart came here to do the interview and the tests that we did on him for Wired magazine. If you go look, he did a article on Wired that was, I don't know, 5-6 years ago. And when he came out, he was doing this immersion, and I had a calorimeter, so he had a mouthpiece on and goggles on, and he was immersed in like 60-degree water for 20 minutes. So we were measuring his metabolism, lots of really interesting things. I'll put some of the stuff was going to be in Our Broken Plate. I'm working on that part now. And but what was interesting is he was sitting there, and when he finally could speak, he said, "What's this noise?" I'm like, "What noise? What is this noise?" He said, "You can't hear that." And it was like August. And he's like, "How can you not hear that?" I said, "I don't hear anything." He goes, "That eeet sound." I'm like, "Oh, those are cicadas." And he had never heard them before. And
Nor
he was just
had
blown
I.
away that
They're
they were so loud.
mind-blowing.
They came out as he was underwater. They just got louder and louder. And then when he was sitting there shivering at first, he could not believe the noise, but you heard them too. And so that's another example. Think about the seasonality of those. I mean, they come, they get loud, they reproduce, and then they go away, So this idea that seasons are there, and your perceptions, how have your perceptions, because you heard this, I know we mentioned it on another show, but you heard this first on Rich Roll. How have your perceptions of all this changed since you first heard it? Because with this backdrop of you being from the city, and not having sort of the seasons out there. LA, which is sort of, same temperature, same weather all year round. You guys are terrified of rain. The point here
Don't laugh. It's true. It's not funny.
So what was it like for you to now change and see seasons, and how has that changed since you first heard Rich Roll and I talking about this?
Yeah, well, the first time I heard you, and I really felt sorry for anyone that happened to live in your world, because it sounded so miserable to spend your entire life hungry and cold. A lot has changed for me, because it did intimidate the heck out of me. I mean, I never thought I would actually try it. I just thought, that's a crazy scientist guy. I don't know what he's talking about. But, the only experience I've really had in more natural setting, besides literally my entire life I've been in Los Angeles. I spent 2 years at UC Santa Cruz, my first 2 years of college, undergrad. And, I'd wake up and the deers were in the quad, and I'd walk to school and the banana slugs were crossing the pathway, and there were forests, and it was so beautiful. And gosh, I loved that so much. That just, like, I viscerally can feel the difference of being in nature. And I know that there's so much research showing how important it is for mental health and well-being. But, I'm much less intimidated by all of that. I've grown more accustomed to being cool. I actually like being cool, I have to say. Like, it makes me feel better because you could always warm up. You could, if you really want to, you could bundle up always, but you can't cool down when you're hot. That's what I kind of struggle with in LA in our really hot summers. But I think it's really been quite a journey. I think I'm not intimidated anymore. I finally got comfortable in the cold showers, the contrast showers. I don't love them. In fact, I kind of hate them, but it feels kind of invigorating. But it's not as bad as it sounds. And I think that integrating some of this, it's something that everyone can adapt to. If I can, anyone can, because it's like an awakening, but it's doable, and you don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to jump into an ice cold lake or anything just to see the benefits. But tell us, actually, maybe people don't even know what a contrast shower is. So why don't you explain what they are?
Yeah, so this is actually something Wim Hof and I brainstormed together in his apartment. And the idea behind contrast versus just a cold shower. So just sort of back up, in Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Body, he wrote a chapter on the cold. And Tim had been doing some stuff on ice baths and other just immersion in cold, which talks about sort of the ultimate in human performance, about what we can do and what we can accomplish. And the idea that this cold exposure does upregulate these metabolic benefits. But in looking at this in terms of how we can adapt and use cold sort of more strategically, rather than going out and buying ice and jumping in an ice bath or risking hypothermia in extremely cold temperature, extremely cold water, the real concept around contrast showers is the idea of using the natural response. So vasodilate, vasorestrict, vasodilate, vasorestrict. So we basically, that all of our tissue is sort of restricting and dilating, because the real way our body regulates temperature, a lot of people kind of want to think that our fat is our insulating layer, and it turns out it's really not, because we have this series of capillaries that go up to the surface of the skin. And what happens is when you're overheated, like when you're exercising, those things dilate and they shunt the blood flow up to the skin so that the heat can escape in the air. And of course, if the heat's not transferring fast enough, then sweat will form on the skin, and as it evaporates, the enthalpy, as Gibbs free energy, delta G equals delta H minus T delta S.
Obviously.
The entropy is increasing. So what we end up having is a drop in temperature so that Gibbs free energy stays the same. That's the thermodynamics of it. But the evaporative cooling that happens in the skin pulls that heat away. And so the point here is that what really insulates our body is our muscle tissue. So in other words, as that blood flow goes deeper, drives deeper into the tissue, all of our muscle mass is staying at a constant temperature. What's really kind of advantage of a contrast versus just jumping in and taking a cold shower, just jumping in to take a ice bath, because when you go in that really cold, what happens is your body constricts, and everybody knows that feeling of plunging in cold water, that constriction, and you can feel it. You can feel it in your face, you can feel it in your arms. And then there's no flow back. So this is why, for example, in really extreme temperatures, people end up getting frostbite of the nose, the ears, the fingers, the toes, the extremities, because the blood flow stops there. And so what Wim does to stay in these ice baths or stay in these extreme colds for hours is he's able to relax enough so that blood continues to flow. If blood continues to flow, you can generate enough heat. A human can generate enough wattage to basically stay warm for a period of time. But if the blood is constricted and the blood stops flowing, eventually the tissue dies. That's what frostbite is. It freezes and it dies. So with a contrast shower, we're talking about, first you're in the shower, so your cold is going to change, maybe 60, 55, maybe it's going to get to 40. It's obviously not going to be frozen because it wouldn't be coming out of the shower. But what you're going to do is you're going to go from warm to cool to warm to cool, right? Instead of, it's not really ice cold. And that contrast is going to cause your body to constrict and then relax and dilate, constrict and dilate. And there's a lot of advantages to doing that versus just cold. So what I want people to do is 10 seconds of warm, 20 seconds of cold, then repeat that 10 times and end on cold. And the idea there is to get some of that cold stress. And the first thing in the morning, it tends to wake you up. Paradoxically, at night, since your body's trying to drop in temperature to go to sleep, that same process actually will make you sleepy and make you go to bed and make you go to sleep a lot easier.
And it bears repeating because we've said this before, but right here is where it really matters, is that you can use melatonin as a way to help dump heat before going to bed. That's one of the mechanisms of action that it helps with sleep.
Yeah. But separate from this, right? We'll come back to melatonin in a second because I don't want to confuse people on this one point, which is there is a big radical difference between that contrast I just said and what happens there in terms of just doing a cold shower, just jumping in a cold shower, because all that does is constrict everything. And yes, it probably does some of the metabolic winter stuff. It does probably help in that way. But you're not really going to burn enough calories in that short period of time for it to matter from that perspective. But what it really will do is get you in that mode if you're also restricting diet, if you're also relaxing and resting a bit and not out, running marathons, again, still not active. It will get you into sort of the fat burning mode over the bigger picture. The other important part of this is that when you're doing something like running or skiing or anything where you're building up all those metabolites of activity, whether it's the lactic acid, right, et cetera, it will drive that blood volume in and out of the tissue and help dissipate that faster. So one of the things you can do right away if you want to use it for recovery, you do the contrast shower. Instead of just ending on cold, have a cold bath, just as cold as it'll come out of the tap water, and just sit in it from waist down. You don't even need an ice bath. And you will find that your tissue, that your legs, the soreness, and it'll happen if you have a hard arm workout or a hard chest workout, same thing. You'll find that just the contrast with the cold therapy will actually make you feel better. It will take a lot of that soreness out. You'll feel more recovered within 30 minutes of doing this. So coming back to what you were saying about melatonin, because that's also an important point, is that a lot of people know sort of tangentially that melatonin helps people fall asleep, but what they don't recognize is that
why
one of those, that mechanism is that, as melatonin is increasing in circadian day, so it'll be the evening, circadian night as you're falling asleep, one of its roles is it causes that vasodilation and you end up dumping heat through your extremities so that your whole body falls in temperature, and that's what happens by 4 a.m. You're at your lowest temperature. And so by taking melatonin, one of the things that you're doing is helping yourself dump some of that heat. Now, you don't want to overcompensate by piling on the blankets and getting in, a heated waterbed, if we're going back to the 70s, or 80s, the big heated waterbed. I mean, anybody who's ever slept on a waterbed where the heater went out, you realize that it sucks tons. I mean, there's nothing more cold than to accidentally have a waterbed that has a heater out. If you're out there, if you're old enough to know waterbeds.
I was going to say, I think you're dating yourself because I didn't even know they were.
I am dating myself, but for those people who are listening, they know exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah. And the fact is it is horribly cold, even though the water in there is just room temperature. It's not ice cold, but it just sucks the heat out of you. And so the point of this is if you have tons of blankets that are holding that heat in, you're not going to sleep as well. So that's kind of another element of that, what you were saying about seasonal affective disorder.
And also it's interesting, I mean, our bodies do make melatonin, and what happens is as we get older, we kind of decrease in production, which is why a lot of people have a harder time sleeping, which is why we peak at our peak amount of sleep that we require is around teenage years when we're growing the most and everything's on high demand. But later in life, it starts to get harder to sleep, and the older you are, sometimes the less sleep you end up with, even usually not even necessarily needing it. But that's why supplementing with melatonin can help boost that level and help you get to that place where you can dump heat a little bit better and hopefully fall asleep a little easier.
Right. And melatonin also is very active when we talk about we talk about the sirtuin genes, the longevity pathways, one of the 4 longevity pathways that we'll talk about in our book, and we also will probably talk about on this show on an episode later. But the sirtuin genes, we know that melatonin has an activation, and in the late 90s, there are a ton of books that are out about supplementing with melatonin and being able to use that positively for health and also for the idea of it having some benefit with, preventing cancer. And I believe that a lot of that is probably tied up with longevity. We didn't know the sirtuin genes at that time when they were doing that research, but I bet going back through it, activating the sirtuins is a part of that. So this all becomes part of that metabolic winter hypothesis. sleeping more. We all know that sleep is positively associated. Getting enough sleep, getting enough rest. We know that the stress, the mild cold stress, whether that stress came through shivering or through exercise or through non-shivering thermogenesis, there's that cold stress, the dietary restriction, all of these things add up to the idea that, hey, it's the fall. Let your thermostat fall a little bit, fall in love with fall, I guess it is. And for us to, think about how we could get more winter in our lives and take some time off.
Yeah, embrace it. Embrace the cool. Embrace a change of season. I love that message. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful way to connect to nature in our modern world. And it's interesting how this stuff kind of gets, taken into all sorts of directions from a commercial standpoint. You see all these places now, people are going to have these blasts of cold, and your friends in New York that have a gym that's
that's
called
right,
Burn.
Johnny and Jim. Yeah, Burn. If you're in New York City, definitely go.
You can go work out in the cold.
Out and check out Burn, because we visited there, and we didn't have a chance to work out there, but they have an amazing gym. It was really great, and they came down here, flew down here before they did this gym, and were consulting, and I just said, hey, go for it. Now, the idea here, and another thing about that, is everybody talks about, do you burn more calories in cold than
hot?
Warm? That's always a question. And the answer is not really. The amount of energy that you burn is probably the same. But everybody taking everything down to the calorie level is one of the problems. Because one of the better benefits to think about is that if you're used to working out in a cooler environment, well, first of all, you can work out more efficiently. You can work out harder, because if you're going to stop of heat exhaustion faster than you're going to stop of being too cold. And I'm not talking about extreme cold, obviously. We're not talking about Wim Hof running barefoot, half marathon on snow in the Arctic.
You mean we don't have to do that?
Yeah, so we don't have to go that far. We need to
interview.
We need to get Wim on. We'll set up and get an interview with him where we can just go crazy with the cold stuff. But in terms of realistic, what you're actually working out every day, or skiing temperatures, for example, because we always talk about the reverse of layering, being used to that and having that cold to help take off that heat allows you to work harder. And so part of what Burn's advantage is that. Secondly, you end up getting used to and familiar with cool, not cold. So at 50, 60 degrees, when our friends in Canada are out in shorts still, you're bundling up in LA. Everybody's got their, what do they call them, puffer coats? Everybody has these big giant coats on because it's 50 or 60 degrees. And so it's a relative thing. So part of the idea of working out in the cold, that's a really advantage. You can work harder, but more importantly, you get some cold stimulation, and you get used to that temperature so that you're not constantly over bundling.
Yes.
Come on.
No, I know.
Now,
and
are contrast
cool?
showers really that bad? Honestly.
Well, they were really bad for me for a while. I couldn't get to 10. I couldn't get to 10 rotations, but I'm proud to report that I did. And I was shocked because I used to get to 6 and I felt really good. Like I worked up to 6, on and off. Mm-hmm. And then when I finally went to 10 for the first time, I was like, oh, actually after 6, it's much easier, which was pleasant to know. And it's kind of fun as a mom. My daughter just started high school and she started a water sport, which she had not done before. And usually I'd be like, oh no, it's going to be winter and she's going to be cold. And now I'm telling her, hey, this is so good for you. I'm glad you're cold, suck it up. It's healthy. But it's changed my perspective, dramatically.
Well, swimming is really amazing in terms of activity. I wish I could swim. I mean, I wish I can swim. And I can swim long distances, but I never feel like I look like I'm in control. In other words, I see these people gracefully gliding through the water back and forth, and it makes me so envious that they look so effortless. But I would love to take up swimming only because it's the only activity you can start at any age, at any level of fitness. It doesn't matter how you are, and you can do it until the end.
Yeah, let me say that actually with my personal training background, that is something I would definitely see. And we're going to have a whole episode on the soft landing for athletes because that's really important.
Yes.
And I really have a lot to say about that too. And swimming is the most gentle exercise that anyone can do. And it's so healthy in a million reasons, not just the cold, just the no impact on your joints. It's just like a wonderful thing to be in the pool.
And if you're a swimmer out there, one of the things I want you to think about is when you get out of the pool, resist the temptation to take the hot shower. If you want to actually turn it, because I was on the ANSI national boards back for about a decade, from 2000, 2009 or 10, for pool standards for commercial swimming pools. And the competitive temperature for pools is around 81 degrees. And at about 80 degrees F is where mild cold stress starts in water. So if you're working out, obviously you're generating heat, just like if you're out working out in the cold. And that heat is being dumped very efficiently to the water. And anybody who's a swimmer knows that if you go to a public pool, normal standard for a public pool is about 84 F. And if you have elderly or infants in the water, they normally raise it to 86. So just those 2 degrees difference, or actually I should say from 81 to 84, and then from 84 to 86 is a huge difference. And if you get in an 86 F pool, to my swimmer friends, and you're trying to swim, you're sweating. You're miserable because you can't dump the heat fast enough. And so one of the things to think about is if you can get to a place that has a cool pool, or if you can swim at temperatures below 80, the sweet spot is probably 75. That's the temperature where you'll get the maximum bang for your cold buck. You'll be comfortable so you're not, freezing, you won't have risk of hypothermia, and you'll have this post-workout cold stress. And one of the things to think about is when you get out of the water as a swimmer, don't go take a hot sauna. I know it feels good and there's contrast. Do the contrast therapy before you get in the water, but don't do the hot afterwards if you want to burn calories. Because there's a lot of this stuff about swimmers becoming overweight because they need insulation or they eat so much or whatever. And it's just food related. It's just the fact that, swimming is really interesting in that it's one of the only sports that you really don't get hungry while you're actively doing it, where you can get hungry when you're running, but you won't when you're swimming. But when you get out of the water
You're
afterwards,
voracious.
Your appetite comes pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And so in that 2 to 4 hours after you swim, don't do the high calorie meal if you want to burn weight. And I show if you go back to that article, I think the data is in the Wired article, at least a bit of it is there. And I'll have a lot more of it in Our Broken Blade, where we show that he actually goes to almost 100% fat and stays there for 40 or 50 minutes until we stop the test. So when you get out of the water, if you're a swimmer, try not to eat a high calorie meal. Try not to take the warm shower if you're trying to burn the extra fat. And probably what's going on with swimmers having a little bit more body fat has more to do with the fact that people who have the right amount of buoyancy, because fat is buoyant, are better competitors. So it may be that they're selected that way through they just do better, because having that proper amount of balance of buoyancy to, sink like the rock, kind of thing is probably important. So anyway, it's another thing to think about, is that swimming has so many benefits.
Definitely. I mean, this is really interesting, and it's just something to start exploring. And I like that we're just introducing this, and I highly recommend everyone check out the paper. But, you can implement some of these things on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and I think it's something we should explore. When we get to the point where get some of these other projects out of the way and we can start getting back into the lab again, I would love to look at activity now from a personal trainer perspective, from your perspective, and do more of these things that I did 5 or 6 years ago, more of the running, more of the kettlebells, more of the swimming, more of the cold experience with a calorimeter, and try our best to learn a little bit more about what actually happens. Because I still think a lot of these books to my right here on exercise physiology, they're generalized, and I don't believe they're accurate. They're consistent.
There's definitely more to the story.
But I think there's a lot more to it. And I think it hasn't been necessary or beneficial to know the exact details, but this is why the conundrum's out there. This is why everybody says, I'm eating right and I'm exercising right and the weight isn't coming off, or, trying to distill it down to protein, carbs, and fat. This just isn't detailed enough. And so, bringing it back to sort of the ending with the metabolic winter hypothesis, I think we need to find a way to put a little winter back into
our
your
winter.
life.
Get a little cool with cool.
And we want to thank everybody for the likes and shares and reviews for the Healthspan Solution. We're so excited to have it out now and hope that 2020 will be a year that we can dig in on a lot of the details in our show. So with that, I think...
Thank you all for joining us on this leafy green path to good health.
It's always the food, so remember,
keep eating right.
Thank you for listening to Science and Saucery. For more details about the content in today's show or to contact Juliana and Ray, please visit us at healthspansolution.com.